Before you romanticize the past, let's be brutally clear about one thing. The medieval world was a cesspit of misery, and you would not have survived it. The comforts you take for granted, clean water, soft bread, the simple absence of filth, were luxuries beyond the wildest dreams of 99% of the population. This isn't a history lesson. It's a stark chronicle of a world engineered to kill you. Let's begin with the one thing that would have you sprinting back to the 21st century. Medieval cuisine, a monotonous and often lethal culinary nightmare. Forget the lavish feasts you've seen in movies. For ordinary people, meals were a gamble for survival. Most peasants subsisted on something called pottage, basically a sad, watery soup cooked from whatever vegetables they could grow, simmering in the same pot for days on end. It was the medieval version of a mystery stew, only instead of hiding vegetables, it was hiding weevils and dirt. Bread was the source of life, but it wasn't the soft sliced bread you know. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and often contained unwanted surprises. Flour was ground between stone wheels, and stone chips would break off and mix into the dough. Forensic analysis of medieval skeletons shows their teeth were worn down to the nub, not from good genetics, but from chewing on what was essentially rock-filled dough. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. A horrifying truth is that much of the bread was contaminated with ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye. Ergot poisoning caused horrific hallucinations, a burning sensation as if being roasted alive, convulsions, and finally, death. Some historians believe mass ergot poisoning may have contributed to witch hunt hysteria, as entire towns began hallucinating at once. Imagine thinking your neighbor is a witch, when in reality, your baker just needed to clean his equipment. Meat was a luxury, and when they did get it, it was often on the verge of rotting due to the lack of refrigeration. To mask the taste of spoiled meat, they used heavy spices if they could afford them. Otherwise, you could only hold your nose and hope for the best. The 5-second rule in medieval times was more like the 5-day rule. And the worst part? You couldn't even wash down this horrific food with water, as most water sources were heavily contaminated with human and animal waste. Drinking plain water was a death sentence. Instead, everyone, including children, drank beer or ale, a weaker version than we have today, but safer than water, because the brewing process killed the germs. One study found that the average medieval peasant consumed about 4 liters of ale per day, and children as young as 5 regularly drank ale with every meal. Medieval kids didn't need a fake ID to drink, they needed one to get water. Fish was also a common food, but it was usually preserved by drying or salting it until it was as hard as a rock, and its smell alone was enough to knock you out. By now, your stomach is probably churning, which perfectly leads us to the next medieval nightmare. What goes in must come out. But in the medieval world, where you relieved yourself was a matter of public spectacle and mortal danger. For the average person, going to the bathroom meant using a chamber pot, essentially a foul-smelling bucket kept under the bed, and when it was full, you usually emptied it straight out the window and onto the street below. The medieval warning of "look out below" wasn't for falling objects, but for falling feces. The common practice in towns was to shout "Gardez-vous," a bastardization of the French phrase "garde à l'eau," watch out for the water, before tossing waste from upper windows. And of course, by water, they meant something far more gruesome. If you were lucky enough to visit a castle, you might encounter something called a garderobe, a hole in a stone seat where waste drops straight down the outer wall. At Dover Castle, archaeologists found a garderobe with a sheer drop of nearly 70 feet. Kings and queens may have had thrones, but their toilets were just drafty holes. For those who couldn't make it home in time, the options were grim, as public areas often had designated open sewers. In London, there were places called common privies built over the river, but they were rare. The job of collecting human waste fell to workers with the unfortunate title of gong farmers. These brave souls could only work at night, and the stench clung to them so badly they were forbidden from public places. Despite this, they were paid quite well, 4 times the wage of an ordinary laborer. The stench of medieval cities was legendary. The River Thames in London was so polluted it was described as a monster of stink. Toilet paper? Forget it. People used whatever was available. Leaves, moss, their left hand, or if they were wealthy, pieces of wool. After a day of drinking ale to avoid disease and finding nowhere decent to relieve yourself, you'd be ready to go back to the 21st century. But that was just the beginning. Medieval life was a sentence of hard labor, a daily struggle for survival. Forget the fantasies of valiant knights and fair maidens. For 90% of the population, life was a brutal, soul-crushing sentence of labor from sunrise to sunset in exchange for a meager amount of food. Most were peasant farmers, working land they did not own. Wake at dawn, work until dusk, collapse onto a straw bed, and repeat until death. They plowed fields with crude wooden tools, sowed seeds by hand, and harvested crops with basic sickles. And during harvest, 16-hour workdays under a scorching sun were the norm. Records from medieval England show a typical farmer burned over 4,000 calories a day. For those not farming, the trades offered their own hardships. Blacksmiths spent their days in smoke-filled forges, breathing toxic fumes and risking burns and eye injuries, while tanners, who turned animal hides into leather, worked with urine and toxic chemicals that stained their skin yellow and gave them a horrific stench that followed them everywhere. Want to become a skilled artisan? You'd better start young. Apprenticeships often began at age 7, when children were sent to live with a master craftsman. These young apprentices worked 6 or 7 days a week for up to 14 years before they could become journeymen. Some jobs were designed specifically for the poor and desperate. Link boys were children who carried torches to light the way for the wealthy at night. And puer finders collected dog feces to sell to tanners. The pay for most jobs barely covered basic survival. A laborer in medieval England might earn 1 or 2 pennies a day, just enough to buy about 2 loaves of bread. With such demanding labor and poor nutrition, your body would quickly break down. Disease was everywhere, and medicine was virtually non-existent. What passed for healthcare would today be considered torture. The medieval medical diagnosis for everything was, "You're probably going to die." A simple cold could be a death sentence. Without an understanding of germs, people believed illness came from bad air or an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors. Got a fever? Time for bloodletting, which involved slitting a vein and letting the blood drain into a bowl. Medieval doctors had one solution for everything. You have too much blood. Let me fix that for you. Leeches were another popular treatment, applied to the skin to suck out bad blood. One medical text recommended using 70 leeches at once for certain ailments. The mortality rate from disease was staggering. About 30% of children died before the age of 5, and the average life expectancy was between 30 and 40. The Black Death killed roughly 50% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Dental problems were especially horrific, as tooth decay was rampant, and extractions were performed by barbers, without anesthesia. Even the available medicines were often deadly. Mercury was prescribed for everything from skin conditions to syphilis. Even if you somehow survived all of this, your troubles were far from over. Medieval justice wasn't just blind. It was a grotesque lottery of torture and superstition, with laws varying wildly from one town to the next. What was legal in one village could get you thrown in a dungeon 5 miles away. Punishments rarely fit the crime. Minor offenses, like stealing food while starving, could result in having a hand chopped off. In England, over 200 different crimes carried the death penalty, including cutting down a tree in the King's Forest. Trials were nothing like our modern court system. If you were accused, proving your innocence often involved a trial by ordeal. A common method was forcing the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 feet. If your burns healed cleanly within 3 days, you were innocent, but if they became infected, which was almost guaranteed, you were guilty. Another popular method was trial by water, where the accused was bound and thrown into a river. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and then executed. It was, quite literally, a no-win situation. For those found guilty, execution methods were designed to be as public and horrifying as possible. Hanging was actually one of the more merciful methods. Being drawn and quartered where the condemned was dragged by horses, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and then cut into 4 pieces was reserved for the worst crimes. Public executions were community events, attracting large crowds. Nobles rarely faced the same system. If a noble was accused, they could often demand trial by combat and hire a professional champion to fight for them. Medieval prisons were dark, overcrowded pits where prisoners were often chained to walls and left to starve. Torture was a standard part of the legal process, used to extract confessions, true or false. If the legal system didn't kill you, perhaps you'd live long enough to experience another medieval terror: warfare. Medieval warfare was nothing like the movies. Forget glorious battles with shining knights, for the reality was chaotic, brutal, and almost certainly fatal. Wars happened constantly. During the 100 Years' War, fighting dragged on for 116 years. Only the wealthiest knights could afford full plate armor, which cost the equivalent of a modern sports car. Most soldiers wore padded cloth garments, maybe with a few metal plates sewn on. Swords were expensive and primarily used by nobility. Common soldiers used spears, axes, or modified farm tools. The most feared weapon was the longbow, which could pierce most armor. Medieval battles were incredibly lethal. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, roughly 28,000 men died in a single day, about 1% of England's entire male population. For peasants, the worst part of war wasn't even the battles, it was what armies did between fights. Medieval armies lived off the land, which meant they pillaged local villages for food and supplies, often burning crops and homes. Sieges were particularly horrific. When an army surrounded a walled town, those trapped inside faced slow starvation, often resorting to eating rats, cats, and eventually each other. Disease killed far more soldiers than actual combat, as armies created perfect conditions for illness, thousands of men in close quarters with poor sanitation. The stench hit you first. Medieval towns reeked of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and smoke. Trash piled up in the streets or was tossed into the nearest river, and butchers dumped animal entrails and blood right outside their shops. The smell was so overwhelming that people carried small pouches of herbs called pomanders to hold under their noses. Personal hygiene was practically non-existent. Most people bathed only a few times a year, and many believed bathing opened the pores to disease. Head lice were so common that delousing combs were standard grooming tools. Clothing was uncomfortable, rarely washed, and worn until it disintegrated. Undergarments were made of rough, irritating linen, and outer garments were heavy, itchy wool. Most people owned only 2 or 3 sets of clothes in total, and shoes were made of thin leather with flat soles. The language barrier would be nearly insurmountable, as Middle English from the 1400s would sound like a foreign language. Privacy did not exist. Most households consisted of a single room where everyone ate, worked, and slept together, and beds were often shared by multiple family members. Entertainment options were limited and often violent. Public executions were treated as festivals, and animal baiting, where dogs would attack chained bears or bulls, was popular. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. The feudal system meant your place was fixed at birth, and about 90% of the population were peasants who owned nothing. Knowledge was limited, and superstition filled the voids. Most people believed in witches, demons, and magical creatures. A solar eclipse could send an entire town into a panic, believing the world was ending. Communication was slow and unreliable, as news traveled at the speed of a walking messenger. By this point, you'd be desperately searching for a way back to your modern life, with its antibiotics, indoor plumbing, and human rights. The past may seem romantic in books and movies, but the reality of medieval life was a daily struggle that few of us could endure, even for a day.